Hello everyone and welcome to the October edition of the First Thursday Club. Very happy to be introducing you to Mark Lang, who is going to be talking to us about solar farms and the opportunities for biodiversity therein. Mark, if you could possibly move on to the next slide, I'll just do a quick housekeeping. I think there's a bit of a delay. Oh, there we are, we got it. Okay, so for those of you who've joined one of these talks before, this will all be very familiar. First of all, thank you very much for joining. We've got 500 registrations for today, so that's very exciting. First thing to say is that your microphones are muted, so you can holler and scream at the laptop as much as you like. We won't hear you. However, there is a questions box, so if you have any questions that pop into your head as Mark's talking, do stick them in there. I will be looking through those as Mark is talking, and I will filter out the best ones, and we'll ask him at the end. It's a fairly short talk actually, so we should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, which should be good. And then at the very end, you will be sent after this a feedback form. So we'd be very grateful if you could fill that in. If you've got any suggestions for other talks, then we'd be very happy to consider them. Right, Mark, if you can move on to the next slide, I'll quickly introduce our speaker. Ooh, there is a long lag, apologies everyone. Right, lovely photograph of Mark from a lumberjack holiday catalogue. So Mark is has been with us for many, many years, longer than he cares to remember, no doubt. He's been a consultant for a very long time. He's an associate director with us in RSK Biosensors, and I've also managed to entice him over to Wilding for about half of his time as well. A very experienced botanist, habitat specialist, ornithologist, protected species expert. He does a lot basically, and he does a lot of work also for SIME. So he was shortlisted for Member of the Year at the SIME Awards either last year or the year before for the work he does for SIME. So he's very studious in the stuff he does for the industry, which is great. In recent years, he's become an expert in biodiversity net gain, hence moving across and helping me in Wilding, and is an expert in the DEFRA biodiversity metric that we use for that. And also as part of that, he's now specializing quite a lot in the solar industry, which he will tell you all about now. So Mark, if you want to turn off your camera, I shall do the same.
Technical internet difficulties today. So I'm going to talk to you briefly just about solar farms and whether or not they are an opportunity for biodiversity, and spoiler alert, I think they are. And I'm just going to run through some of the items I'm going to be discussing within the webinar. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background about why I think we need solar. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the constraints to solar farms. There's quite a lot of solar farm rhetoric in the public domain at the moment. I'm going to talk about how I think we can maximize the opportunities for biodiversity. And rather than talking about specific management interventions, I'm going to talk more at a sort of strategic high-level view, really. And then discuss a case study that I've been involved in. It's aspirational, it's not yet been consented or built, although it's a fairly long way through the consenting process, and hopefully will be built in the next couple of years. And finally, we're going to have time for some questions at the end. Good. So while I just wait for it to catch up. So why do I think we need solar? So first thing, nuclear. Although I accept that nuclear is going to be part of the energy mix of the UK going forward, there are a few issues with nuclear. Hinkley Point, the next one to come on stream, it's billions over budget and at least 10 years delayed. Sizewell C, I know quite a lot about Sizewell, having been the ecology lead for a long time, but Sizewell's at least 10 to 15 years away. And the other two, Wilver and Moorside, rest in peace. The investors pulled out, so nuclear is not perhaps as good as we thought it was. And also, we need to remember there's no central nuclear waste repository, so that little kind of issue about what are we going to do with the waste hasn't gone away. We also need to remember that our energy demands are not going down, particularly with things like the drive to digital, storage to digital data, all of this, just, electric cars, all of this means energy demands are going up. The wind doesn't always blow, and conversely, the sun doesn't always shine. Russia and Putin, nobody would have anticipated the effect that that would have on global energy markets. It just shows what a volatile and unpredictable world we're living in. We can't keep burning fossil fuels. I think the summer we've just had in the UK and Europe was a prime example of that. Global climate emergency is here, it's real, we're seeing the effects of it. So I don't necessarily think fracking and exploration for more North Sea oil is necessarily going to help us. And there are some predictions out there about what the UK might look like if all of our energy requirements come from 100% renewables. And it's estimated that we can perhaps deliver about 250 gigawatt of solar. That's likely to require something like 1 and a bit % of the UK land area. So it's not huge, but we also need to think that the rest of that energy mix would come from onshore wind, which would be about 12% of the UK land area, and the rest of it coming from offshore wind. So although solar doesn't occupy a huge area of land, it does occupy a sizable area, and we also need to think about wind as well, although at least there's more room underneath turbines.
Right, we got you. Marvellous.
Right, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the constraints that solar farms are posed. One of them is the availability of land, and I've called this a bit of a land grab. And there's an issue at the moment. We're a very small country with a limited land area, and land is coming under increasing competing elements, really. So there's the need for food security, there's the need for carbon sequestration with new tree planting, there's need for new infrastructure such as housing, not least solar, and also the drive to address the biodiversity crisis as well with new habitat creation and rewilding. All of this takes room, and solar is in that mix. I think the first suite of solar farms that were delivered 10, 15 years ago were not particularly well done, although they had regard to biodiversity. To my mind, they were more about farming the subsidy than delivering high biodiversity. There is also, I think, a bit of a zeal amongst the industry with low carbon energy, with solar being seen as unequivocally green. And although I think it's relatively benign, we have to remember that all forms of energy production do have a footprint, and perhaps with solar we haven't really been fully upfront articulating the impacts for landscape, biodiversity, and particularly local communities. And this is particularly relevant now given the size of some of the solar farms that are coming forward. I'm working on schemes now that are 10 kilometres from end to end and maybe 2-3 kilometres wide, so we're not talking about insignificant development. I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about the not in my backyard syndrome and the fear for change. And I also think in the past there has been unrealistic promises about what solar would do for energy bills and the temporary nature of solar farm development. We're talking now about schemes with an operational life of 30 to 40 years. And to my mind, that's far from temporary, and our energy bills are not going down anytime soon. And this is partly because energy bills are more related to the world energy market and cost of oil and gas. So, not in my backyard and the fear of change. This is quite it's not viewed as it's a bit of a sort of universal insult, I think. But people do legitimately fear change. Change is the one constant in our lives. And I think we need to not view NIMBYs as negative, but as legitimate stakeholders. And I think it's encouraging and right that local communities do take an interest and engagement in what's happening in their local environment. I mean, all of us will be NIMBYs at some point or other. I think we need to be upfront about the potential for change and potential impacts on local communities. And I think we need to engage and anticipate and try and resolve these in advance if we can, kind of confront it head on really. I think at the moment we tend to go through an assessment process looking at predicted impacts, receiving criticism and negative commentary, and then trying to resolve and mitigate. Whereas I think if we delivered some of this up front, I mean, we all have a fairly good idea about the impacts that solar development is likely to have, and we could, I think, resolve some of these issues up front, and it would mean that we can be seen to be listening and ready to change and deliver, I think. Also, we just need this honest dialogue about what we mean by temporary, and also ensuring the benefits to local communities are robust and transparent. This might mean more public access, could mean many things, but if we're going to have this change in the landscape, and solar farms are sizable developments now, and they're in the landscape for a significant period of time, so we need to ensure that we're much more robust about that. And I think overall, what this is telling me, that across the UK as a whole, we need government to be thinking about a much more joined up land management strategy, because land is valuable and there's not very much of it within the UK, and there are many competing resources that are after land to deliver various things, and we're going to have to think much more strategically about what we want each piece of land to deliver. So how do we maximize biodiversity opportunities? And there is no size fits all answer here, and I'm not going to be telling you anything particularly revolutionary, but I do think we need to be thinking about it in a slightly more strategic approach, really. So we need to be joined up, and schemes need to be biodiversity led, and this is an iterative process that's going to involve all of the project partners in informing the evolution of the design for a solar farm. I think the wrong approach, which is generally what happens at the moment, as with many developments, is that biodiversity and net gain is a bit of an add-on done after the master plan is completed or largely complete, and I think we can be a bit more clever about it. So things like understanding our existing ecological constraints, understanding what land use and other constraints might exist, so things like visual and landscape concerns, cultural heritage concerns. There are areas within solar farm development that can't be developed for solar farms, but these might become our biodiversity opportunities. So if you can't do one thing, can you do something else? We need to understand biodiversity priorities from a local and regional context. So rather than imposing habitat creation that may or may not be appropriate, we kind of need to understand where our solar farm sits in the local and regional context and what those priorities might be. Also understanding what habitats and species fit with the local landscape character and context. So a good example, I'm involved in a scheme in Lincolnshire. It's big, open sky country, large sort of prairie-like habitat. And there's an absence of linear features in the landscape. So it would be inappropriate to put hedgerows back in, although these would deliver biodiversity benefit, they would be out of keeping with the local landscape character. So it would be better to think about habitat creation like extensive grassland, for example, which would fit in with that kind of open, big sky type landscape. And I think we also need to have more regard to the local and national nature recovery strategies that are ongoing, because solar farms are significant, they're in the landscape for a long time, and we can make a real meaningful contribution to these initiatives, I think. Also understanding the local BAP priorities. Although the local BAP process has taken a bit of a back seat, we haven't seen an increase in biodiversity. So all of these original local BAP priorities are still relevant, and solar farms can make a fairly significant contribution to them, I think. And ensuring our habitat creation and enhancement proposals are well linked. And I mean well linked within a scheme, but also well linked within the wider landscape. So can we be linking, you know, local nature reserves, local wildlife sites, SSSIs, can we be making meaningful linkages across them? This is nothing new, of course. It all stems out of the Lawson paper about 10 years ago, this kind of bigger, better and more joined up. I don't think habitat creation enhancement proposals have to be complicated. There's plenty of evidence for agri-environment interventions that do deliver real biodiversity gain into the farming landscape. But we do need to understand the capacity and resources to deliver habitat management. So we're quite good at ecologists at writing habitat management plans, but these tend to be a little bit prescriptive, and we don't necessarily understand whether or not we have the capacity to deliver that on the ground. So who's going to be managing these sites? And we also, I think, need to develop in some adaptability and flexibility. Things like the planning process, the biodiversity net gain process, they do drive us down a prescriptive approach. And there are good reasons for that, partly because we're looking at quantifiable outputs in the future, but that's not necessarily the right way forward. And although we need to be prescriptive to understand what our kind of commitments will be, we need to try and have some elements of flexibility within that. We need to understand and ensuring that local communities can benefit somehow from the habitat creation and measures that we're putting forward. And we need to remember the land underneath the panels. There's quite a lot of focus on the periphery and the buffers and the land between the panels, but there are benefits to be had from the land underneath the panels, albeit it's a slightly drier and perhaps a slightly more shaded environment, but it just means that we just need to think about what's appropriate there. And also the need to be open about results and contribute to research. So there's a bit of evidence out there about the impacts of solar development on biodiversity, but there are also quite large gaps, and we don't necessarily know what the best, most cost-effective interventions are, and there's a lot more work to be done there, I think. And we also need to remember it's not just about biodiversity. We need to think about how we can maximize ecosystem service benefits. So whether this is reduction in nutrients, there's a lot of concern at the moment about nutrient vulnerable zones having an effect on our sort of coastal and wetland ecosystem, and farmers are finding it quite hard to reduce fertilizer input, but solar farms have an opportunity to help with that. We can help potentially with flood retention, water quality, carbon sequestration, soil health, soil fertility, public community well-being. There's a whole lot of stuff I think that solar farms can deliver, and we need to remember that all of these are not incompatible with biodiversity. They go hand in hand together. And I think, although I think it's a minor issue, it's been inflated by government and rhetoric, but need to address this loss of food production. Now, even if we reach maximum solar, it's less than 2% of the UK land area. We're already not very competitive in terms of being sort of sustainable with our food production, so we're not self-sufficient in many things. And I think bigger issues like climate and the world market are the issues that are affecting farming. Also subsidy and changes to agri-environment policy since we've left Europe. But we do need to be mindful of the fact that we are, in a sense, taking land out of production for a period of time. But there are elements that we can think about to address that. So it is possible to have some element of agricultural production, such as grazing from solar farms. And maybe we can also take a longer term view, and can we improve soil health and soil fertility? If we can return land after 40 years being under a solar farm in a much better condition than adjacent land that's heavily farmed and dependent on continued inputs of fertilizer derived from fossil fuels, then surely that's got to be a good thing. So just talking you through a case study, and I have to emphasize it hasn't been consented or built yet, although it's a long way down that process, and it went to DCO beginning of this year. Some of the elements that we're thinking about here, just to give you an idea about taking that slightly more strategic view. So thinking about land outside of the red line boundary that isn't needed for solar production. There's a SSI river here that's in pretty poor condition. It suffers from nutrient input. not much semi-natural habitat either side, so there's a good opportunity here to restore the floodplain grassland. It's pretty poor grassland at the minute, pretty dull, not interesting, and restoring it to sort of species-rich landmass meadow could have many advantages, not least biodiversity, but also in some improvement in water quality, some improvement in retention of water in flood conditions, and also improving soil health, I think. There are areas outside of the array that weren't needed. These could be linked together and we could have some really good flower-rich grasslands established in these areas. We don't have the constraints of the panels within the land, so we can manage them traditionally, you know, hay cut, aftermath grazing, that type of thing. We've also made sure that all of the priority habitats that were already existing on site, which in this case was little blocks of ancient woodland and the farm hedgerow network, these have all been retained and buffered and the scheme designed around them. You can see the blue lines on the map. These are the existing rights of way. They're quite hard to see underneath the array, but they're still there. So we've been thinking about actually embracing that, enhancing the right-of-way network so that it's more inviting and easier to access than the existing footpaths across arable fields, and thinking about the margins of the footpath, so putting in some wildflower mix and legume-rich pollinator seeding, which can cope with slightly higher fertility. So trying to create a very sort of bright, vibrant, nice to look at habitat either sides of the right of way. Hopefully that will increase biodiversity, and hopefully it will increase the sort of well-being and make it slightly more inviting and mitigate to some extent for the change in the visual landscape that you'll get from the solar farm. And perhaps the most exciting element within this is that the client has agreed to set aside an area of the solar farm that we can use to trial habitat interventions with a suitable academic partner, and we have selected our academic partner for this site. I have a conversation with them this afternoon, and what we're trying to get to is trialing different types of habitat intervention under the panel. So is it best just to let nature do its thing and just let it rewild naturally? Do we need to topsoil strip and create species-rich grassland, or is just putting a pollinator mix the best option? Just trying to address some of those evidence gaps, I think, so that we can counter the anti-solar farm rhetoric with good scientific-based evidence. And this is only the start, I think. There's a lot of research out there, and lots of academic institutions such as Keele and Lancaster are working on solar farms and contributing towards it. And I think this could be the start of a much wider kind of solar research hub, so that the industry is driving the research really, and hopefully we can understand what the best interventions are in a given circumstance that would deliver biodiversity benefit, because there is no one size fits all, and different interventions for different things would suit different sites, I think. And just a overview and run through of that again. So I think it's clear that the site that I've worked on, myself and my team, it builds on very good quality and detailed ecology work undertaken by the wider project team and a client that's motivated and engaged. So we're building on solid foundations, and that has made our life a little bit easier. Not all of our clients are as motivated. We're making sure that we're linking existing habitat across the site. Existing priority habitats are retained and buffered. We're considering enhancement in land outside of the footprint of the array, but immediately adjacent, as well as the development of the margins and the hedgerows. We're looking at the land underneath the array. Pollinated greenway, so enhancing public rights of way, biodiversity net gain, delivering tangible public amenity, setting aside area for academic research, so we increase the evidence base, and we estimate conservatively that we'll get well over 100% biodiversity net gain. But just thinking about what I was talking about earlier in terms of flexibility, so the client hasn't signed up to all of the aspirations within the sort of visionary biodiversity vision that we have for the site. They've committed to a minimum within the DCO, which would deliver substantial biodiversity benefit. So we're talking 78% they've committed to. But what we're hoping is that some of the wider aspirations that we have within our biodiversity vision will be taken forward, and that the final scheme post-consent will deliver much more than the 70 to 80% that they've committed to from a legal point of view. And this is just so that elements are a bit flexible, and although they've outlined what they'll do from a minimum perspective, we still retain some flexibility if elements are not deliverable. We have a meeting next week just about grazing, because although the estate has a flock of sheep and they're prepared to graze underneath the panels, the way that the sheep are managed, because they tend to graze on breckland during the summer, it may not be suitable for them in the winter because they might not put on enough weight and various things. So it may be that grazing is not possible here, and we need to think about another management intervention underneath the panel. So it's that type of thing where we're trying not to be too prescriptive, but whilst being prescriptive enough to ensure that the scheme can get consent and meet its kind of obligations under the planning and biodiversity net gain. And finally, it's understanding that nobody's perfect and we could have done better on this scheme. It was developed in some isolation from the original master plan, so it wasn't as biodiversity led as it could have been, and we could have had more emphasis on wider ecosystem service benefit. But I think what's important here is it's an iterative process, and we have learned some lessons from this scheme, and those are being applied to the two schemes that I'm working on at the moment. I'm developing the biodiversity vision for another two large solar schemes, and there are further schemes planned in the future. So we learn the lessons, I think, from each one, and it means that we apply it, and basically the approach gets better and the more biodiversity led we are. And that's it. And now time for some questions. So I will just end the presentation.
Good stuff. Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. If you can stick your camera on so we can see your gorgeous visage.
I will, although it'll probably all slow down.
Yeah, it does look a bit like you're in solitary confinement. Right, well, I did only have a couple of questions, and it was all going to be quite straightforward, but they've suddenly been pinging in.
I might turn my camera off, actually, just to see whether that helps with.
Okay, so the first question is, what is the easiest but most effective biodiversity intervention on a solar farm project? Oh, you still there? Have we lost you? Mark, are you there? Oh God, it's just me. I'm going to have to answer the questions. Mark has disappeared. This is bad. Right. Okay.
Maybe turn your camera off, John.
Oh, you are there. You are there. Right, Mark, can you answer that question? Did you hear it? Maybe I'll turn my camera off, as you say.
I'm still here. Yeah, I just turned my camera off thinking it might. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Right. So what's the easiest and most effective biodiversity intervention on a solar farm?
Yeah, I did. So I think it's a good question. I think it's a good question, and I think the best intervention is to think about. Can you hear me?
We can, yeah. We can't hear you now. Come on, Mark. Are you there?
Okay, I think the best intervention we can do is to think about what we do underneath the panels, because that's the largest area, and it might just be letting nature take its course, see what kind of weedy grass we get, or it might be thinking about sowing some kind of legume-rich mix that benefits invertebrates, because basically if we can get more plant species underneath the panels, then we benefit invertebrates, and that has benefits for farmland birds in the vicinity, and that's probably, I think, the easiest intervention. What I would try and avoid, if at all possible, is complex operations like topsoil stripping from underneath the panels, because although this may deliver low nutrient status, which is good for trying to develop wildflower meadow, that type of thing, I think we need to be mindful of carbon release and the need to protect soils, and ideally we would leave soils in place and take a more kind of regenerative farming effort, I think, underneath the panels. That's what I think the most positive intervention we could do, very simply.
Okay, that's interesting. You've sort of answered the next 4 questions more or less, but I will ping those over. So this is from Gemma French. She says, do you have a wildflower or grass mix that you recommend for underneath the panels, as taller growing species can cause shading of the panels and cause management issues?
Yes, I would agree. I don't have a general recommended mix because I haven't thought about it in enough detail, but I think it's probably thinking about nectar-rich species that are not particularly tall growing. So maybe thinking more about kind of our ephemeral and ruderal weed species, because weedy doesn't have, not particularly attractive, but it's good for invertebrates. So maybe legume rich again, so things like bird's foot truffle, things like some of the clovers, and avoiding some of the taller, coarser grasses, I think. So less cocksfoot and maybe more Bespoke rubra type thing. So a traditional kind of hay meadow mix, but maybe taking out some of the grass element that tends to be slightly taller.
I wonder if it'd be worth almost developing a solar farm wildflower mix, which takes these things on board. So you've got a kind of almost a bespoke mix of
possibly, but it's whether or not one size fits all, because different things might be, depends on your local soil type and where your solar farm is. But one of the elements of research we were thinking about is whether we could perhaps develop a seed mix that's perhaps more suited to the shady, slightly drier conditions underneath the panels. So maybe something like a hedgerow base mix, maybe a bit of red dead nettle, thinking about, trying to think of plants, thinking about ground ivy.
Should come in.
Yeah, well, you have to think about it. So it's things that are sort of low grown but adapted to an element of shade, perhaps, is what I'm thinking. So almost like a woodland edge or sort of hedgerow base mix that don't have those elements of sort of tall reader or tall grasses within them. But I think that's quite a good question.
Well, there are a couple more actually that are very closely related. So one from Adele and one from Matt. I'll ask both of them at the same time because I think they're pretty related. What is your view regarding how to classify habitats underneath panels with regards to BNG? So there's a lot of, there's a lot of guidance.
Very good question. The way that we've done it in terms of baseline is to classify them as to what they are, when you obviously start pre-construction. So either arable cropland or modified grassland in UK HAB terms. In terms of post-development scenario, that's slightly more complex and depends what your aims and aspirations are in terms of habitat creation. At the moment, for small solar farms where we're just intending it to be grass underneath the panels, slightly diverse but not that diverse, we're thinking about other modified grassland. But where we're thinking about definitely sowing some kind of wildflower mix, then we're thinking about other neutral grassland but slightly higher quality. We have in some instances thought about lowland meadow as the sort of destination habitat type that we're aiming for, but this tends to be in margins around the edge of fields and fields that aren't necessarily subject to the array development, because I think that the shading's likely to
it's almost as if you need sort of a solar farm grassland category in the metric almost, because it will be different.
Yeah, well, I think other neutral grassland works as long as we're conservative and upfront about what we think the habitat condition might be. But even just grass with slightly weedy grass has slightly more diversity than intensive arable and can deliver the biodiversity net gain that we need from a net gain perspective relatively easily. But this is where we need to think slightly wider, because we also need to think about the potential for the margins, the potential for the hedgerows. Do we have a farmland bird issue? Do we need to be providing some farmland bird winter food resource or that type of thing? So it's not just under the panels, it's taking everything in as a kind of complete package, I guess. But anyway, I hope that kind of slightly answers that question.
I think so, yeah. Matt Davey asked a couple actually related to that. So I think his first question, if I can find it, wow, millions have come in, was how do you recommend dealing with retained grassland in the metric? So that's what you've just been answering. Yeah. But he also said, related to your answer, do you think the habitat condition should be poor if shaded, or could it be classified as retained with same condition?
I think we need to be honest about it. I think we can increase habitat condition, but I don't necessarily think we can get as far as very good condition. But it partly depends with what we're starting with, and even starting with modified grassland of poor condition, even if we're conservative and get to moderate underneath the panels, given the area of some solar farms, that's still a substantial delivery of biodiversity net gain. We need to remember though that the metric is just a tool, it's just a spreadsheet, and we shouldn't be too governed by it.
Yes, it's guidance, isn't it? Yeah.
But I also take the point though that we also need to be aspirational, because just allowing grass to develop underneath panels doesn't necessarily deliver all of the biodiversity that we would want. And ideally, I think probably the approach I would like to see, particularly on some solar farms, is just a kind of a bit like Satisfied, where they just allow the grassland to develop and whatever weed community in the soil comes up. But that sort of rewilding approach, I guess. But a rewilding approach is not dealt with particularly well with the deframetric, because the deframetric is looking at predefined habitats, whereas if you just kind of let nature go and take its course, you don't really know what the result will be and how do you classify that result. I'm hoping that within the new version of the metric and guidance emerging, that we'll see a much better understanding about how we can take a rewilding approach, which I think in some cases might be appropriate, but at the moment it would cause problems in terms of what to classify the habitat as, and I understand.
Okay, Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt. I feel like I'm a presenter on the Today programme, but I'm going to chip in there because there are quite a few questions. Adele also asked a question, and I noticed you had a picture of a brown hare in the presentation. Those species of open farmland habitats, she's asked, have you considered how to mitigate the impacts of solar farms on ground nesting birds, for example?
I think it needs to be bespoke mitigation, because obviously we're unlikely to get birds nesting underneath panels. There is evidence that we can increase foraging availability of habitat underneath panels, but yes, we are losing habitat that ground nesting birds will use. But arable farmland is generally quite poor for ground nesting birds, intensive farmland. So what we need to be thinking about is how we increase the nesting capacity of the adjacent farmland. And in some instances, it will be bespoke mitigation, I think. I'm dealing with schemes where we have nesting curlew and nesting lapwing, so both species of conservation concern, and just covering the entire site with panels is not going to be acceptable. So it might be that we don't build on certain fields, or it might be that we set aside areas within the wider solar development to account for nesting birds. But I think a large portion of it is increasing the carrying capacity of the adjacent farmland. And it's not necessarily easy mitigation, but yes, I think it's a valid point.
Okay, there are a couple of questions about sort of alternatives, if you like, to using land. Chris Thomas has suggested tidal energy, given the issues with water, wind, and sun. Do you think that more should be done on tidal?
Yes, absolutely. But we need to be cautious about what we mean by tidal, because what I wouldn't want to see is the complete Severn barrage reappear just because of the damage that would do to the River Severn and the River Wye and migrating fish. But I do think that tidal energy has a place, and I think it's been underfunded and under-researched, and there is a need for more research into.
Yeah,
I
agree
definitely.
with that. And Kara's question is kind of a halfway house almost. She's talking about floating solar. I know we've got floating wind
Yeah.
farms out in North Sea. Is that something you've looked
Yeah,
at?
it's not something that I've looked at, but I don't see why it shouldn't happen. We have quite large inland reservoirs, which, you know, elements perhaps could be used for floating solar. The only thing I'd caveat is we'd need to think about implications for wintering birds and what happens if we put a solid surface on top of water. Is there a collision risk with birds landing? There's already some evidence that large solar farms can be mistaken for water by wildfowl species, so that's something that we might want to consider. But I certainly think floating solar has a place, yes.
Okay, we're not going to get through all these at all, but I'm going to do one last one because we're nearly on time. This is again a slightly different subject. So this is from Adam Tompkins. Have you found ways to ensuring local communities can robustly benefit from biodiversity enhancements? Objections do move around in their focus depending on what's the most likely to scupper the scheme. Have you found any effective ways to convince people that benefits are genuine and meaningful?
I think by engaging upfront and early. I mean, it's early days, and I've not had to deal with the consenting regime for big, large schemes yet, although we are about to. I think it's just trying to anticipate and understand some of their concerns, and when we're thinking about the design of the solar farm, thinking about how we can directly benefit local communities. So an example of a scheme I'm working on in Lincolnshire is that the local estate has obviously taken large strides towards providing public access in some places by providing car parks and making sure that there are circular footpath linkages, that sort of thing. And I think we can help with that by thinking about the areas that are adjacent to where there are car parks already. So some of our habitat creation, like nice flower-rich meadows, could coincide with the areas that dog walkers are using at the moment, because the fields are already contaminated and jeopardized by the dog waste. So why not just take advantage of that and actually think about developing something a bit nicer, and just thinking about our design really, and taking things in the round. So taking local people's concerns as an early consideration and designing the solar farm around those concerns. So thinking about what the landscape and visual concerns are going to be and design your solar farm accordingly. I think it's embracing.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the nature of. I mean, sometimes they are objections for objection's sake, aren't they? So it's trying to work that out. Okay, look, we're gonna have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Mark, thank you so much for that. Mark has committed to try and answer these questions offline afterwards. There are quite a few of them that have pinged in over the last few minutes. So we will get those answers to you, assuming we've got your email address in the questions. Right. So just to say that our next First Thursday Club next month will be Jenny Hughes from Nature Positive, and she's going to be talking about ESG and building momentum in construction, facing current industry challenges and embedding sustainability. Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry for the internet issues that we've had.